Lots of words have more than one meaning in our language, and sometimes this can cause problems. An American says football, and a British person hears the word and they picture what Americans call soccer. And there are problems like that surrounding the word myth. A common usage of myth in everyday conversation means something like something that's not true, like an old wives' tale, an urban myth. So that usage isn't wrong, but if it's the only way you ever hear the word used, then you might think of the word myth in a pretty negative way. That's just a myth. That's something we say if we want to dismiss what another person is saying as rubbish. So, like I said, this usage of the word isn't wrong, but myth originally meant something else. And that meaning is also still valid. And what people mean when they talk about Celtic myth or Celtic mythology, it doesn't mean a pack of lies or something only silly people believe. So this is the definition of myth that I use when talking about Celtic mythology or teaching it. Myths are stories people have believed for many generations, which cannot be fully confirmed, usually concerning their own origins, their culture, and gods. And these stories have a high degree of stability over time. In other words, they don't change very much or very fast. In an oral culture, these may be preserved by a recognized group of professionals. So let's break that down a little bit. Stories that people have believed for many generations. So obviously chemtrails and the idea that the moon landing was fake, stuff like that is recent. People haven't believed it for generations. It's just something that's going around. Whereas we can see that the stories we find in the medieval Welsh and Irish texts are very old. They're much older than the manuscripts in which they were written down. And these stories go deep into the culture, as this next bit says. They can't be fully confirmed. They aren't what we would call history, and yet in a way, they tell the story of a particular culture and its gods or other religious ideas. The stories have a high degree of stability over time. While that doesn't mean that they don't change at all, there is a tendency to treat them with a certain reverence and try and keep them alive. The ancient Celts, of course, they were famous for being an oral culture. They resisted the use of writing for things like their stories. Their bards and druids spent many years of their lives memorizing vast amounts of lore. They memorized poetry, they memorized stories, genealogies, the law, medical knowledge. The bards and fili and druids were the Celts' walking, living library of Alexandria. And although writing slowly took over in the medieval period, that attitude that things must be preserved, not through some kind of game of telephone or Chinese whispers, but through the hard graft of memorization by rote. Years of people's lives were dedicated to nothing but memorizing this stuff. Now, that's not to say it didn't change, but there's evidence that it didn't change very fast. It got updated when it no longer made sense. It got updated because the language had changed. That's the kind of timescale we're talking about. There were old-fashioned words in the stories and no one knew what they meant, for example. This is the real magic of Celtic myth. There's a very slow distillation process over centuries, even over millennia. I see people wishing they could find the original version of a myth. They try to reconstruct an Indo-European myth or something. And in a way, I get that. But in a way, I'd say that many of the stories we have are not degraded or broken. They reflect many centuries of refinement by the people they belonged to. So we like to complain about the Christian scribes, but this was part of their culture too. So before we leave this, I just want to take a quick look at some of the story types that are adjacent to myths, because sometimes it helps us to define what a myth is by defining maybe what it isn't. If you like my videos, please share them, comment, or give them a thumbs up. There's more free content on my Patreon page and on my website. If you're feeling spontaneous, you could buy me a cuppa on Ko-fi right now. All the links are below this video. Legends, stories that concern people who actually existed, or real events, but which exaggerate or mythologize their characteristics. And these are usually things that happened quite a long time ago. Legends are usually about famous people or events which get bigger and bigger with the retelling. Sometimes they might eventually turn into myths, or at least that's one theory. So there's a theory that at least some of the gods in true myths started out as great kings or heroes or something like that, and their legends grew until they were revered as gods. I'm not personally convinced that that's what happened with Celtic myths, but I can't prove that it did or didn't. But I think what we can say is that characters like Art and Conn in the Cycle of the Kings are treated in the stories almost as if they are gods, but only almost. So another kind of story type we have that's adjacent to mythology is folk tales. So these are stories about common people, usually, and everyday problems. These often include supernatural beings who are not deities, fairies, selkies, water horses, giants. Folk tales are often preserved in families or in communities. They're often much more localized. There's often recognized and valued tradition bearers. Now, these aren't bards and feelies and druids, but nevertheless, there are people who are recognized in a community, and that's important. I just talked about the druids and the bards and the feely, but there were, shall we say, lower classes of storytellers in Celtic society too. This might be an old person in a village who knew a lot of stories and probably gained some social currency by entertaining people. But many tradespeople were itinerant, people traveling along with goods for sale. Tailors were very important, and they were often itinerant, and they would stay with people while they made the clothing that people asked for. And their stories were often in demand. They might start with the gossip from the next village, but many of them knew traditional stories, and some of them also knew mythological stories. But folk tales, as I said, they tend to be about common folk, farmers and fishermen and women who can do magic, children who are stolen or orphaned. Very often they experience contact with the supernatural. Maybe they're cursed by a witch, maybe they're helped by the fairies, maybe they're eaten by a water horse. Sometimes it feels like certain kinds of folk tales are like scaled down versions of mythological stories. And there's a whole theory about that. So one theory says myths are scaled up folk tales or scaled up legends. And another theory says folk tales are scaled down myths. And there's some truth in all of that, I'm sure, but I don't think it's like there's one right answer for every story. So the Welsh stories about fairy brides who come out of lakes and marry farmers are an example of this. Those stories are they're like working class versions of the tales of kings and sovereignty goddesses. So you can see that these categories of stories will have some overlap. We can't completely ring fence myths and legends and folk tales and fairy tales. They bleed into one another. But we can still identify many stories as being myths because they are about gods, because they're about cultural origins, why we do things the way we do, that sort of thing. But that doesn't mean they're lies. It means that they're special and venerable.